Your last comments, though, do lead us to a question that I am really curious about. And you've alluded to it, but in your book, you give a really stunning example of the efficacy of a clinical intervention at the level of the signifier, an interpretation that, to use your words, hit the mark. Now, one example that you will obviously be very familiar with, and many of us who teach and think about Lacan have used this example before, is Suzanne Hommel, right? So this is, I think, around 74. She's in analysis with Lacan, and he does this intervention when she uses Gestapo. And of course, you know, it's a word with connotations, but he turns it into a gesture, and it seems to be an absolutely transformative effect on the analysand. Now, many people who've done a certain amount of a Lacanian analysis will have their own examples of this. But my question then is, those moments when we have something which is immensely powerful and transformative for the subject, maybe sometimes they don't always have to be absolutely transformative, but people who've experienced it will know, you know, how powerful they can be. My question then is, why are such interventions so powerful? Powerful in the sense of being potentially transformative. And it's a question that I'm sometimes asked. And then I think, you know, well, the answer is obvious, but is it? And sometimes I want to say, well, it's because the analyst seems to have spoken to the unconscious, or in the same register of the unconscious. But I'm left wondering if that's an adequate response. I'm wondering what you're thinking, Tom.
It's a good question. And for the folks who watch this who aren't aware of this, the Suzanne Hommel, the story is interesting. She was a child in Poland, I believe, when the Nazis occupied Poland. And she, some years later, was in analysis with Lacan. And in the course of one of the sessions, if I recall the details right, and you can find this in Gerard Miller's documentary where he interviews analysands of Lacan who are all talk about their experience of being in analysis with Lacan. And she was discussing a dream, if I remember the details right, and she mentions to Lacan in a session that she always gets up at 5 o'clock in the morning, and then makes a side comment that 5 o'clock in the morning was when the Gestapo used to come through her neighborhood rounding up people for the concentration camps when she was a child. So she tells the story that Lacan jumps up from his chair, walks over to her and places his hand on her cheek like this. And she immediately, she says, recognized that it was a gestapo, a kind of gesture on the skin, that was an equivocation to Gestapo. The word in French, Gestapo and Gestapo, sound very similar, obviously. And she said it had an effect on her, and she could still feel the touch of his hand on her cheek. So, it's worth watching and hearing her describe this, and many people have commented on the impact of this little testimonial from Suzanne Hommel. So why is it effective? I would argue that it's not effective because it has something to do with meaning, because there almost is no meaning to it. Gestapo, gestapo, I mean, it's not that it unravels any sort of hidden meaning for Suzanne. It doesn't. My argument would be a couple things. One is an observation that its effectiveness is a function of the equivocation. There's an equivocation, Gestapo, that seems to be operative in that. And I believe it's something that captures the real in some way. And the real isn't captured by meaning because, by definition, the real excludes meaning. So when we talk about getting a handle on the real or grasping the real or extracting the real, Lacan uses these different words to describe this. I think that's what happened in this interpretation of Suzanne Hommel. The example I give in the book of the example from my analysis, I'll just, you could get more details in the book, but I'll just say briefly for the purposes of this interview, there were two things going on for me. One was my weight, my bodily weight, and a problem with that. And that the other was that I had been waiting to accept an invitation by some colleagues to give to give a seminar. And all of a sudden there'd been shifts happening, and I decided to accept the invitation to speak. And all of a sudden I found I was losing weight. And my analyst says, as an interpretation in a session, the wait is over. It's a totally banal phrase, but it captured the equivocation in weight, the two different meanings of weight. Weight is a bodily weight, and weight is in waiting. A person waits for something, as well as a number of other things. And I discuss in the book, different dimensions of the impact of that interpretation. But I think the most important thing I would say about it is that the interpretation was able, again, through equivocation, to capture something of the real for me that was at stake in my analysis. So I think these interpretations that are powerful, to me, to use this term, or seem to be high impact, to talk a very American way, I believe are ones that somehow capture the real. The Luc van der Vennet case that I discuss at length in the book has another one. It's a patient who rushes around somewhere, and he makes a noise as his interpretation that has no meaning value as such, but captures the real for that patient. So I think, Derek, for my perspective, is that's these moments where it's things seem to move, or I think are moments where language is not delivering meaning, but is able to grasp the real. So
yeah, that's really great, and it makes me think at some point the whole attempt to rationalize and engender meaning about what has happened in that, as it were, real event, in a way is kind of missing the point, right? It's not being able to explain it because it's precisely not within that register that the efficacy of the impact of that moment has occurred. So yeah, no, I very much appreciate that. It does make me think, though, that in the example, the Suzanne Hommel example, what one should also bear in mind is that some of the examples that I've been thinking about in terms of my own analysis, in terms of what colleagues have been kind enough to share, there's often a signifier which encapsulates this equivocation. So yeah, there's that, but the gesture that Lacan performs there, I mean, if I remember correctly, he doesn't speak it, right? It's this performative gesture, which is, you could argue, maybe even more powerful, which leads us to some other interesting speculative avenues. But I suppose the one thing I would emphasize about that is that she puts two and two together, right? So there's something about the subject's role in the efficacy of what has just, efficacy is a terrible word to use in the Lacanian context, but whatever. There's something about the subject's role in what happens in this real moment. And we don't have to develop it further, but I think that's kind of crucial as well. And it seems to me to be in a way obvious within the whole of kind of the Lacanian project, really, because it's not simply about the mastery of what the analyst can do, but it's about the subject's realization within a moment of prospective impact, an opening, a fertile moment of sorts.